The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome back. We're up to topic 3, week 3 of our MOOC comparing Scrum versus Lean. And as I'm sure you're all anticipating, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about Lean tonight. I just put up the poll there for everyone to have a look at the answers that were put forward for those of you that logged in early and had the chance to register your views. I'd note that there's a big polarization of results at the bottom end of this. The answers here suggest to me that a lot of people seem to think that Lean is a good idea and they're either trying to or they're struggling to implement it. And some of why that's the case might come to light with what we're going to talk about this evening. I'm pleased to see that at least somebody works for a totally awesome organization, because I thought they might have gone extinct, but apparently they're still out there. So thanks for contributing, all those that did get in early and put your answers down on the forums. Let's kick over now to our presentation, and I'll just go through the usual housekeeping things again tonight. All right. So all those of you who have been involved in this the last couple of weeks, you'll have a bit of an idea of how this works. But I'll give the quick rundown for anyone who might be joining in for the first time, and a reminder for those that are that have been here before. Please, if you have anything to ask, comment, suggest, etc., use the questions box. We will pause a couple of points for questions along the way. We do want to encourage to have all the questions put up there. We will make sure, by hook or by crook, by some method, we will get answers for all the questions at some point, even if we have to do that separately. So we are collecting and accumulating unanswered questions, but please do put them up there, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the discussion tonight before we finish up. For those of you who haven't already, I would really strongly encourage you to get onto the online course portal, have a look at what's there, participate in the forums. There's been some good discussions already. There's been some great answers and some dialogue with people making some contributions to different questions that have been asked. So there's been some discussion there already. Obviously, the webinar recordings will be found on the portal. There's some study guide information there. But I also really want to encourage everyone to get their teeth into the pre-recorded audio that's there. What we discuss here in these webinars are an add-on and are based on the assumption that you've all had the opportunity to listen to what's in those pre-recorded audios at least once. So we are also going to have questions from both the pre-recorded audio and the webinars included in the final test that comes up in a couple of weeks. So please, I encourage you, if you can, have a listen to those things. They're usually up there at the latest on Monday. So you should have about 15 minutes, 18 minutes each on average. So hopefully that will be something that you can get into before the webinar begins. The portal address, of course, for anyone, hopefully you've all had access to that now. You've got your emails, etc. Now, as usual, any admin questions, background questions about what's going on, please put them through, and James will be able to answer those in the questions box as we go bit by bit. So, Lean. Let's start with a quick definition of Lean. In this context, we've got a couple of definitions here. Number one, containing little or no fat. When I was a young man, Lean is what my mother used to call me when I dropped in on Sunday for a meal, thinking that I was not feeding myself properly. The second, of course, is the thrifty in management, economical. It's a way of saying things are without the unnecessary. And this is kind of simplistic. We look at this and we listen to what Lean might have to say, and we say, well, yeah, this is all fairly straightforward, but why is it so significant? I mean, what's wrong with being a little bit fat? Organizations have had the opportunity to have extra of things all along. I mean, especially large organizations that a lot of us have worked with or worked for. We have been in situations where organizations have had money to spare, excess for this, excess for that. There's never been a lack of investment at certain times, obviously economic climate notwithstanding. But the real issue that has plagued us in more recent economical times is the need for differentiation. And the issue with Lean and its importance now, and why it's more significant now, or why the intentions of trying to be Lean are more significant now, is that it's now surprisingly easy for organizations to deliver their product or service at highly competitive rates and to a relatively high standard. So the margins for differentiation and therefore the margins and opportunities for profit, except for obviously brand new industries, but for traditional industries, it's quite difficult to compete and get your share. And so organizations are constantly striving for ways in which they can scrape that little bit more out of what they're doing and how they're doing it. So we're kind of saying that gone are the days when we can afford to be a little bit too relaxed about things such as efficiency and economical activity. Now, this isn't necessarily a new idea. Most of us would think, well, of course, you know, we're all sort of thinking we probably should be a little bit more efficient about what we do or a little bit more economical. But the drivers behind it are relatively, what's recent about the drivers is that they're universal now. And part of the information that we saw in the poll that was put up at the beginning is evidence of that. There is a strong trend towards the awareness that we can't leave any stone unturned when it comes to finding every opportunity to get lean and economical with what we're doing. So it's this universality of the concept of saying, yeah, well, we have to be more efficient about this. We have to be simpler and we have to be more effective at it. So no, it's not a new concept, but the depth of energy with which we're going about it is a little newer than it was. It's something a little bit more consistent. Although, as we saw in the poll, there are still that share of organizations out there who are not yet feeling that this is something they need to do. There's not as much pressure for everyone. It's not totally universal. But when it comes to making things more efficient, when it comes to being more economical, just in a pure, simplistic business sense, you want to be more economical because you want more profit. Well, let's assume that's an obvious statement. But there's two ways in which organizations can go about it. And we call them an output versus input model. And what we mean by that is that you've got two ways of going about it. You can say, well, we do all this stuff and we want to do more with all of it. So we want to be able to just increase our output, produce more of this, deliver more service, cater to more customers, whatever it is we're going to do. But we're not going to increase resources. Now, generally what tends to happen with that model is that pressure gets applied in the wrong places in the delivery chain. So when we have a model that says we just want to be able to deliver more, then what we're seeing is that the breakpoints that were already struggling and were already the reasons for inefficiency get worse. The input model is we're saying, well, we want to be able to do the same things, but we want to be able to do it with less. So we want to look at all the areas in which we're doing things that aren't adding to value. And that is the core paradigm that began or is lean in its concept. So lean is not about necessarily let's see how much extra stuff we can ship with the same activity and effort. It's about let's find all that activity and effort that isn't contributing to what we produce and see if we can remove it. But there's one other aspect of trying to get efficient from a business point of view that's worth mentioning and talking about from this point of view. And this is the idea of replacing something. And I'm talking about replacing from the point of view of an organization saying, well, our process for XYZ is inefficient, so we're going to replace it. And what tends to happen in this paradigm is that rather than looking at how you do things already and then trying to just trim off the fat, as it were, and do things more effectively, an overhaul process is brought about. And many of us would be familiar with this idea where the assumption is that by saying out with the old and in with the new, we are therefore going to get something more efficient, more economical, more lean. But generally, yes, there's some small opportunity for that because when we throw out the old, we are going to be throwing out the old, and some of the new is going to be probably a little more efficient, more effective. But generally, that is a different process. And if we just do that, if we just have this replacement mentality without thoroughly testing how lean the new ideas or the new method or the new process or the new paradigm really is, then we're not lean. We might be evolving, we might be growing, we might be adapting and learning, we might actually be doing things better, we might even be more economical. But under the definition of what lean is meant to do, we're not necessarily, technically, a lean organization. So when you are involved with ideas or projects or situations where the idea is let's just replace it with something better, remember that's only half the answer to the problem. The other half is, well, what does this new better thing look like? How is it built? And under what paradigm, under what methodology, under what philosophy are these new methods, new way of doing things being created. Now, the quote we're kicking off with tonight is from a gentleman, Jawaharlal Nehru, and he was the first Prime Minister of India back in the, I think, 1947, thereabouts. And that was obviously a time of significant turmoil in India. And his quote here, where he says that obviously the highest type of efficiency is that which can utilize existing material to the best advantage. It's a pure and simplistic statement of what efficiency meant to him. And it's a statement that kind of sits across what Lean is trying to do. It's saying, well, there's two sides to it. It's utilizing existing to the best advantage. But not only utilizing existing, it's questioning the value of what's existing. It's questioning the value of what is being delivered by what's there. Now, before we can look at the question of saying, what should we take out? In Lean, we're saying, well, let's trim the fat. How do we know, how do we even have a starting point to guess or understand what fat might be? The very beginning of this process is to have a concept of vision. And the vision we're talking about here is an absolute clarity of knowing in detail what it is we're trying to achieve. So if you want to be a little vague about exactly what you're producing at the end of the day in terms of products and services, then you're probably going to want to have a little bit more fat in how you go about it, because that variation is only going to come about when you've got room to play with and things that you can play fast and loose with in the production cycle. But if you want to trim out all those extra things and have only what you need, you've got to be really clear on exactly what you need. So in a similar way to other principles, we start with a clear understanding of the vision. So we're saying if we're going to be efficient, we're going to be efficient at doing what? Exactly what? Precisely what? So when we have this alignment process, what we're saying is that in the creation and delivery of anything at all, a product, a service, a project, we have people involved, usually a number of people. And the first step towards all of them having even a chance of becoming cohesively efficient and economical is for them to be aligned towards that clear and succinct purpose or the goal, which comes from the vision. So the role of vision is not just so that we know exactly what we're going to create and therefore what we can cut out. It's so that everybody knows that, and so that everyone can have that in mind as all of the individual incremental decisions get made along the way. Because remembering, this is all about human beings. So everything that gets done and everything that gets performed and every decision that gets made, whether we're involved in a project or whether we're involved in anything else, it's human beings that are past masters of being inefficient about what we do things. It's because we have that emotional element. Being emotional creatures, we have this vast opportunity for variation in how we feel like doing something today. And so the principle of vision is to say, well, let's make sure that everyone has the opportunity to clearly comprehend what the objectives are and what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. It's in conflict, or rather it's to combat this variable nature of human perception. But it's not enough to just have a vision. There are two sides to the creation of vision. And traditionally, the kind of old-fashioned method is to create what internally is perceived that the vision or the outcome of the product or the service needs to be. And this is the old-fashioned idea of saying, well, if we build it, they will come, or they will buy it, as the case may be. So in Lean paradigm, we're moving to the idea of saying, well, no, the only definition of the vision that really matters is the customers, because they're only going to pay for what they perceive to be of value to them. So even in recent times, the whole idea of market research, yes, that was an idea of saying, well, let's go out and ask the customers, and then let's bring all this data back in-house, and then we'll still create and make our own decisions of exactly what we think the customer needs. And, you know, we've all seen those astounding outcomes of organizations that have produced them horrible outcomes, which we really thought they would know better. You know, we really thought that they'd have access to the right kind of data to interpret what the market wants, and yet somehow they don't. So the process of interpreting exactly what the customer wants isn't necessarily easy, and partly it's because it's often difficult for organizations to be that honest about it. Organizations that come from a background of saying, well, we know what we're doing and we're going to create it, there's a lot of vested interest and there's a large sunk cost in that methodology and in that thinking. And it can be a difficult thing to move away from, to say, well, look, you know, we're going to abandon all that and we're just going to focus on the customer's vision of what they really need and they really want. So don't be surprised when you see anchors in the water about changing from a internally driven plan to an externally driven plan of what actually needs to be done. Now, in the case of some projects, this can be a little bit easier when the project is a third party. If we're talking about creating something that is being paid for by someone else, it's a little easier for everyone to get their head around the fact that person paying, therefore they get to make some decisions or at least tell us what they want. But this gets a little more blurred when the customer of our project is internal, because there's not the same commercial driving force to give them the opportunity to say, well, we want to respect your wishes, we need to pursue your customer satisfaction, we want to deliver what you want. Oh, no, they're just the sales team. We know what they want. We'll sort that out for them, don't worry. Or, you know, words to that effect that I'm sure people have heard in various times. So when we're talking about the role of vision in Lean, it's the source of what we call the value statement. And Lean is very much about saying, well, we want to create value. And some of you are already thinking, well, yeah, this is kind of familiar. We've already talked about value and we've talked about vision. And these are some of the points of commonality that make this part of an agile thinking. But the vision is the ultimate and first source of the value statement. And we will talk a little bit more about value streams later in the discussion this evening. So we'll be able to cover in a bit more detail what we mean by the value statement and how we map it and how we think about it. But it starts from the vision in concept. And one of the benefits about having this position from an external point of view is that it has an opportunity to be more positive. And positive ideas are more easily embraced, they're more easily supported, they get buy-in from the rest of the organization more effectively. This is echoed with a quote that was attributed to the Dalai Lama. So he says, in order to carry a positive action, we must develop a positive vision. And so the point here is that when we create the vision, it needs to be fairly carefully positive in nature. We want to make sure that it's working and going to create or evoke positive response in all the contributors and stakeholders and people that are involved in making it happen. Now, before we get in, I'm going to take a little bit of chat about the history of the Lean framework. Just before we do, I just want to see if we've got any questions that have come up already that are worth chatting about. Has anyone got any questions that they want to throw up at this point? I don't think we've had very many. I just wanted to see if we've got anything there. James, do we have anything worth covering, or should we encourage a few more?
Not at the moment, Brenton. There's one question that we'll just put off till the end because it's not about Lean, so we'll put it in the bank to be answered on the forums later.
All right.
So if anyone's got questions about Lean and the topic tonight, just put them up and we'll prioritize them and Brenton will answer them for you.
All right, excellent. So we haven't really got our teeth into too much yet, but I do encourage you to get those questions up there and we'll go through it a little bit. So let's have a look at the history. Let's see where these ideas have come from. Whoops. I've lined this up, and this is a borrowed image that tries to tell the story about the progressive origins of these ideas over the last half century. Most of these ideas began sort of where industrial processes changed rather dramatically after World War II, and were triggered a lot by the need in manufacturing during World War II. There was a great need in places such as Japan and the United States to produce things fast and efficiently, as well as many other places, of course. But these two places became intellectual breeding grounds for new ideas for how to do things in a much more efficient way. And they began with a couple of individuals, some of the original ideas, people you might be familiar with, such as Henry Ford and W. Edward Deming, who came up in the sort of the mid-1900s with these ideas about they began with just saying quality is important. Well, Deming became the start of the idea of saying quality is important. Quality means value. Ford was saying predictability is value. He's saying be efficient, only do what you need to do. He obviously created the first assembly line automobile, etc. Now, where that went to is where Toyota created the idea of their Toyota production system, which led to become the lean system today. And the other methodology went down the path of a quality focus. And we'll drill down on the difference between those two in just a moment. But you can see where they start to merge. On the right-hand side, we've got the idea of increasing quality, reducing variation, making sure that things happen the way they're expected to happen, total quality management, TQM. And then now we're looking at things like methodologies such as Six Sigma, how to minimize variation in your outcomes. This is the part of the output model to some extent. On the left-hand side, you've got the lean production system. Only use what you need to use. Only do what you need to do when you need to do it. This is where, in the 1980s, Toyota had the just-in-time methodology, and just-in-time plays a big role in the paradigm of lean, which we'll elaborate on in a little while. But you can see there's this merging occurring in the current era of combining these two ideas of let's be lean about it and deliver quality. And these two paradigms are coming together and merging into a singular set of concepts, which is kind of a natural evolutionary path for these ideas, because back in the 1950s, these were new ideas that it wasn't necessarily clear how they could all work together. So if we look at the two different areas or the two different thought processes, they are two halves of the same idea. Let's do, on the left, let's do what we do with less, and on the right, let's do it to a higher standard. Let's line them up in a little more detail, compare them a little more closely. So I'm talking about TQM. Now, TQM is one of those nefarious things that is, lots of people have slightly different interpretation. It's really just a definition of maximizing quality. Let's look at it from that point of view. Quality. Lean is lack of wastage. So we say, first off, lean is, and this is just talking about the really core principles. Lean is saying let's reduce waste. Let's only use what we need to use. Let's only have what we need to have, and we'll drill down on a bit more about how they do that in a little moment. Quality is saying, well, let's reduce variation. It's just another way of saying reduce waste, because what TQM is, or quality is saying, look, there is wastage in getting the thing wrong at the other end. There's wastage in having low quality. There's wastage in poor customer satisfaction that can come out of low quality. So the reduction in variation can be viewed as simply a category of waste reduction. Lean has another really key component, which is the idea of creating flow, making sure things flow in sequence, one after the other, in a very tight line. Whereas what quality is saying is we want fewer errors. Yes, it's nice for them to all line up, but the focus on quality is a lack of mistakes. So how do these two things line up? Well, in a nice, neat, tight flow of activity, you need to have fewer mistakes for the flow to actually exist. One leads to the other. When you have mistakes, you have things that have to be done again. You have to have things that have to be checked. If you have higher errors, you need a greater level of scrutiny and auditing. All of these slow down your flow. So in the process of creating a good flow, you need to, by its very nature, have fewer errors. Now, the third major element of lean philosophy is saying it's a pull system. So this means that everything that's done is triggered and defined and initiated by what happens or where it needs to go, and at the very end of that is the customer. And again, this is something we'll drill down on in more detail in a moment. But the idea is we don't push things into the production cycle. We don't push things in and say, well, we've done this bit and somewhere down the line someone's going to make use of it. No, we only do something when that someone down the line is going to be ready to make use of it. So that someone down the line says, I need this now, or we need this now. And if the flow is tight, it should be arriving for them just when they need it. Quality management is saying, well, part of our core principle is saying we're going to constantly analyze things for ongoing improvement. So every time there is an error, it's investigated. How can we have avoided this error? When we get variation, it's an investigation. How can we improve upon this error rate? So these things line up and are different ways of completing the same thing. And you can see some are subsets of others, and they have a very similar effect on the entirety of the process. So I want to summarize an overview of a lean sequence. And this is, again, these things are very simplistic. And I want to just preface this by saying that some of you might have already noticed that lean is a bit more of a philosophy than Scrum is. Now, I just want to ask everyone, when you're thinking of your questions, hold off a little bit on the questions that ask, how does this compare to Scrum? Because that's what next week is all about. We're going to line the two up, and we're going to show exactly where we think that Scrum would be good, Lean would be good, and why. So we're going to make a much more direct comparison next week, and I don't want to preempt any of that with some of the things we talk about tonight. But Lean is a more high-level, conceptual, philosophical thought process, but there's more to it than that. The reason that's the case is because Lean is much more about the questions. Lean asks the questions of the organization. Lean asks the questions of the project. What about this? Is this efficient? Is that efficient? Is this working right? How is this happening? Whereas Scrum is much more likely to want to give answers. Scrum is a lot more prescriptive in its nature. So it's saying you'll do it this way or you'll do it that way. Now, the Lean sequence that we're looking at here, it's not necessarily a strict sequence, but it identifies the core principles that are prevalent in the Lean thinking mentality. So starting at the front, we say identify value. This is sort of the vision statement. Identify the value that we want to create. Let's be clear on what the outcome really needs to be. And this is a lot different from having an understanding of saying, well, we think this is what it needs to be, or we think this is what needs to happen. Next is we map out what they call a value stream. Now, a value stream is the sequence or the flow of activity that needs to happen at the large scale, at the macro level, in order to achieve the value. So it's like a process map. It's saying, well, if we do this, 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 and this, we're going to get this result. But it's very high level. Now, if you compare that, for example, to plan-based project management and say, well, okay, that sounds similar to a work breakdown structure or a scope of work, for example. Well, yes, there are some parallels in the process. It's a planning stage of what are the major components of activity, but only the major components. So if you're comparing it, for example, to a work breakdown structure, you're only looking at the highest level of breakdown. And I've got an example towards the end of what a value stream map might look like. So if you've got an idea of what you're going to achieve and a map of how that might come about, the next step is to create a flow. And the point here is we're saying make sure that the connection points are tight. So if you're talking about in the manufacturing sense, you're talking about things such as the automobile rolls down the assembly line, make sure that the person who are installing the doors have the doors arriving, well, just in time. Don't have 45 doors lined up there waiting for 45 cars that aren't going to come through for another 3 days. And don't have the door installers standing around wondering when the doors are going to turn up and holding up the entire assembly. So this is what I mean as an example about flow. If you're talking, for example, about software projects, well, that means that make sure that when people are creating tables in a database to store data, that the information that they need to understand of what's going to live in that database has been provided and is available to them. It means the flow of saying, well, before we can create an interface or a menu system, we need to have an understanding of what the functionality is underneath. So there's certain sequential things that need to come out of it. It's like when one piece of code or section of functionality is complete and it moves into being dealt with in another way by another section of the team or another part of the process, it happens in a smooth fashion. This is different from saying, well, we're going to create this other little piece of software or this other aspect of it, of the software that isn't going to get used or woven into anything for another 6 months, but we'll create it now because it sounds interesting and we'll do it that way. That's the opposite of that. So it's creating a flow that says that the interconnectedness of what gets done and when it needs to be done has some arrangement to it. Now, Paul, we're talking about here, Paul is saying that make sure that it's not, or the decision of exactly what gets created and when. Remember we said just in time? The only way we're going to know what that time is based on the section or the stage of the process that is ready for it. The push doesn't achieve that. Push, in contrast, is a way of saying, well, we're going to create it whether it's needed or not. And lastly, the seek perfection is an echo of the constant revision. It's about saying that we're not going to have this revolution process, which is what we mentioned before, the replacement model, where we just live in one way of doing things for a couple of years and then we suddenly overhaul everything and do it all differently, usually because some new manager has come in and told us to. And then we're going to just do it that way until, you know, apathy sets in, and that's how we do it. That's the opposite. Lean is saying every cycle, every process, every step, every review, you're looking at how you can take away what doesn't need to be there. Now, we're going to talk about a summary of the Lean principles, and we're only going to pull out 5 of them, and then I'm going to talk about each of them in a little more detail. And these are going to echo what we've just talked about with the Lean sequence. So we are going to go through each of those and variations on that in a little bit more detail and break them down a little bit further. So before we do that, let's just see if I've got any interesting questions that we can tackle here at the moment. I just want to look at there's a question here from Alan saying, whenever the talk revolves around efficiency, lean, etc., people start thinking about downsizing and layoffs. So is this aspect something that is covered within the lean thinking, i.e. the value statement? So I guess it's a natural progression, Alan, of what we've just talked about. I've talked about cutting out the fat and taking away what we don't need. And yes, the fear and the implication and sometimes the answer to that question can be people. There are many examples of organizations that have too many people inefficiently achieving something that could be done with fewer people. That is an inescapable reality of what the lean process can trigger. But whether or not the consequences of that downsizing are opportunistic or tragic is an entirely different factor, which is outside the purview of what lean is trying to do. So what I mean by that is that if you say, okay, well, we've got 25 people in this department doing these things, but if we can do these other superfluous things, we can cut that down to 20. What are those other 5 people going to do? Well, you know, they've got a lot of experience at this, we can retrain them, we can add this extra product or service, we can do this other thing, this value add, etc. That's a HR issue, that's a company management issue, that is not a lean issue. So lean doesn't pass judgment on whether or not those people need to be laid off or repurposed. But yes, it is something that can be an obstacle to the adoption of lean for a lot of organizations, where people start to worry about their job and think, oh, if we get all lean. I mean, the inherent problem there is that a lot of the time people feel that they do and need to live off the fat that still exists in the organization. Usually, in my experience, if you're talking about large organizations, where this paradigm lives is in the difference between organizations that have a unified vision and organizations which don't. What I mean by that is that, I mean, I've seen some large technical organizations and 2 highly competitive organizations, which I won't mention names because you'll know them. But these 2 organizations, by comparison, compete in the very same technology space. One of them has a very strong policy of unifying their staff into a core vision. And so the staff are generally engaged and empowered to work towards the common goal of the organization. The other organization, by comparison, tends to allow power bases and departments and sectors or different areas of the business to operate as silos, where those in responsibility or in charge of those areas have a degree of power and authority and autonomy to run it largely the way they want to. And yes, they all do subscribe to the high-end company vision, but as long as the numbers are there, well, then it's kind of okay. The net result of that is that the variations of efficiency can occur and can be significant from one department to the next. And they can go up and down based on who is in charge of any given department at any given moment. So in those sorts of organizations, the consequence of downsizing is a lot more likely and can be a lot more dramatic, because those sorts of things can mean that the organization isn't lean because it's not structured to be lean or not at the organizational level. It happens by accident at the departmental level. Let me just tackle another question. I've got another question there from Peter saying, in creating flow for software projects, for example, how are the just-in-time aspects managed in environments where it is difficult to accurately predict effort or timeframes for different stages? With the prediction of just-in-time effort, of when it needs to be, this is part of the mapping of the value stream. And yes, it can be very difficult, especially if you're in an exploratory or empirical kind of project where you don't necessarily know enough about all of the details that need to occur. And so sometimes the value stream needs to get created in an iterative process. Now, if you're talking about manufacturing, obviously that's a lot harder to do because you're investing in large-scale hardware and assets and plant, etc. But when your project is intellectual property, it's often a lot easier because you still have a sunk cost of time and effort, but you don't have an asset cost to go along with that. So it's a lot easier to have a just-in-time principle that says, well, we're going to plan our value stream to this extent. And like I said a moment ago, we're going to review the value stream. We're going to deliver to a certain point and say, well, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, but we're going to review it often enough that says, well, we need to change that. Now, the moment you start doing that, if you run into situations where you're saying, well, hang on, that principle sounds great, but, you know, we won't get everyone to agree on exactly how you should do that. Well, then you need to start looking at things such as Scrum. And it's kind of a prelude to what we're talking about next week, but you might be beginning with some intentions and ideas of a lean model, and you're saying, well, we're going to use some elements of Scrum in order to achieve that. So the short answer is you will need to graduate and iterate some of those decisions. How exactly you iterate will depend on whether or not you can do it loosely or whether or not you need to do it in a tight fashion. I'll grab one more question before we move on. If Lean as a framework got kind of mixed understanding between framework and methodology now. Okay, so there's a question here about which is a framework and which is a methodology. And at the risk of kind of mincing words and semantics about all of this, a methodology is something that is a guiding hand on how something should be actually performed. A method of doing things, a way of doing things. But a philosophy, a concept, is a way of thinking about it, a way of conceptualizing or understanding it. A framework is kind of a set of rules that says, well, you've got a lot of flexibility as how you do this, but don't break these rules. So you've got these three different layers. This is how I would view it. A philosophy is simply a way of thinking about it. It could be even an attitude. A framework is saying, well, let's take this philosophy and put a few rules. So we're going to say, this is how we think about it, but these are the concepts that we feel are fairly sacred. So a framework then is what Lean, I would describe, fits into. Agile is a philosophy. Lean is a framework that says, well, we've got this philosophy of being agile and we've got some rules that are part of the Lean paradigm. But is it a methodology? Some people would say it's not. If you want to get a methodology of how to do something, then maybe you look at what Scrum is, a method. Hopefully that helps build a little bit of a picture of how these things come together. So let's look now for a moment at some of these details. The Lean project principles, and I'll run through this list reasonably quickly because we're going to drill down on each of them over the next few minutes. First of all, the big one, the top of the list, reducing waste. And I know you've sort of heard me talk about this a fair bit. If you've listened to the pre-recorded audio, you would have a lot of information already about the reduction of waste. It's top of the pops when it comes to Lean ideas. Just-in-time decisions. Now, the whole issue of timing is a relatively complex one. It sounds simple, you know, yeah, we'll do this just in time. But on the other hand, some of you might be thinking, well, hang on, isn't that risky? Isn't the whole idea of just-in-time flow inherently risky? Because what happens if you have a variation in your flow? What happens if you have a variation in your timing? We'll talk about that in a moment as to how we tackle those sorts of things. And absolutely not denying the fact that this strategy has those kinds of risks associated with it. Another principle that has probably already come to light, this constant flow of activity, and it echoes back to the reduced waste element. If you've got a constant flow of activity and everything neatly dovetails into the next thing, then ergo by their very nature, you are minimizing waste. You're not having idle time wastage, at least. Pulling from capacity is where we say, well, the whole process pulls from the ability to get something done. The capacity of the client to pay for something is the beginning of that capacity pull. So we're saying, well, the customer wants this, and they have the capacity to pay for it, we have the capacity to deliver it. Then you look at each incremental step and you say, well, capacity, the ability to make use of something means that something should be ready to be used and taken advantage of and evolved and developed. And the accumulation of value, the ultimate goal of this is we're saying that value is the only objective we're aiming for. We're not trying to be efficient at doing nothing in particular. We're not trying to be efficient for something for the sake of it. We're trying to be efficiently creating value, and we can't lose sight of how we are accumulating value, how we are measuring value, and how we are being judged on value at every step of the way. Henry Ford once apparently famously said that it has been his observation that most people get ahead during the time that others waste. So the point out of this is to say that we've got two ways in which we can approach this. We can find the wastage that might exist and repurpose it, and repurpose that energy and effort and use that to get ahead. Or we can be the ones that don't get ahead because somebody else will. Now, lean does have some clear definitions on a few things, and you might have guessed that because the removal of waste is the big thing in lean, that you're going to find some definitions of how this works. And again, for those of you who've already listened to the second, I think, of the pre-recorded audio, you'll have a head start on a lot of what we're going to talk about. Here is what was originally defined as 7 deadly sins of waste. Now, they've been expanded upon, which we'll talk about in a moment, but I want to go through a little bit of a discussion about what each of these really mean. And we'll start with the original 7 from the lean principle. First is defects. Now, it's kind of obvious. If something doesn't work right, if some part of it isn't right, if some part of our code is buggy, some part of what we've created is not quite right, those defects are a waste, clearly. They have to be fixed, they have to be done again, they have to be corrected, they might have to be scrapped and rebuilt. The second one is motion. This is about the waste of activity. Things that are done that don't need to be done. So in motion here, we're talking about the motion of people and the motion of machinery. If we're talking about a software development, we're talking about the time and effort of individuals to create things that don't get needed. One of the best examples of this in the software environment is elements of code that don't get used. And the reason they don't get used can be many and varied. It could be because the person is creating something with a incomplete or unclear understanding of what they should be doing, and they have to then go and do something different. It can be a waste because they're doing something in a way that is inefficient and could be done better. It can be a waste because it's something that is no longer required or isn't required by the customer. I mean, there's a number of different reasons for that. Each one of those, lean is saying, well, look, if it comes down to a waste of effort, of motion and movement and things happening, then it's something that needs to be investigated and prevented. The third on this list is inventory. Relatively straightforward, this one. This is about making sure that we don't have things in inventory stockpiled that we don't need. Now, some of the organizations I've worked for, some of the larger organizations, or the people that I know have worked for, the greatest example of whether or not there's an inventory problem is the stationary cupboard. Now, I've worked for organizations where to get a stapler, you've got to sign a form in triplicate. I've also worked for organizations that if you walk up to the stapler cupboard and open it, you can take your pick. So the paradigm that results in this is based on the concept and approach to the nature of inventory. Now, obviously, staplers don't cost very much, but there are other things that do. The next on this list, extra processing. Again, another fairly straightforward one. It's about Do we produce and create extra work? Do we produce extra things that we don't need? In a software paradigm, it might be creating a nifty feature that the client doesn't want, doesn't need, doesn't ask for, doesn't get included in the final release. It could be creating more cars than we think we can sell. But overproduction, which is at the bottom, is a slightly different thing from saying, well, we're going to have extra processing. It's extra steps that need to be done in order to achieve these things. Overproduction is where we say, well, if we have too many things that we've created, they might not sell, we might have to discount them, they might not get included. Extra processing is where we say, well, how much extra work is needed? How much extra paperwork? For example, filling in a documentation in triplicate to get a stapler? Is it necessary? Could there be a more efficient way of getting things done? Transport, the moving of things from A to B. I mean, the simple process of walking around the floor of an office, getting things done. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about digital materials, there is a transport cost of saying, well, if it's a large thing, if it's a large file, do we have to, can it be transferred? Does it have to be put on a medium and sent? In a production and creation environment, do things get moved from one part of the factory to another? Do people move from one part of the factory to another? Waiting time, this is the idle time concept, which we've touched on already. Waiting is where somebody would be working on that new piece of code, but they haven't yet got some document from somebody who helps them and is needed to begin work on it. Or, you know, they can't put the doors on the car because the doors haven't arrived yet. Waiting time is one of those hidden things that is surprisingly common and surprisingly difficult to spot and find and measure. We're generally far more inclined to tolerate waiting than we think we are. And when you spread that across an entire organization, it can be amazing how much waiting time actually exists. And overproduction, I've actually already touched on and kind of confused it a little bit with extra processing. So I just want to clarify that again. Overproduction is where you make too much of something. Extra processing is the extra unnecessary steps that are involved in creating that something. Now, what are the extra things? Well, there's some people have said there's some things missing out of this. One of them is wasted human potential. Obviously, if you have someone who is highly capable, experienced, and they're in charge of the stapler cupboard, that might not be best use of their talents. I'm sure many of us have been in situations where we've been performing duties that aren't utilizing our ability to the best. So wasted human potential is definitely a form of waste. If someone could be performing something that contributes to a greater degree towards value for the organization, why shouldn't they be? And another one that's fairly popular in being added to this list is uncertainty, confusion, often coming out of communication methods and paradigms. Uncertainty of, well, hang on, what are we meant to be doing with this piece of code? What was the decision on this? What was the plan for this? Wasn't this user story changed? Didn't we have to do something differently here? Uncertainty leads to waiting. But that would still go in the waiting category. The waiting time or idle time that results from confusion and uncertainty, you can put it in either category that you like. But some people say that uncertainty and confusion is just a trigger for many of the other forms of wastage. If you're talking about purely intellectual ideas, intellectual property creation, then certainly confusion and uncertainty can have its own separate category of wastage. People can simply take longer to do something because it takes more brain power to get to a point where they can deliver it. So there are three categories or groups of wastage that Lean breaks this all down into being. Now, these are subcategories of wastage, where they can come from. But this isn't necessarily that useful to us. These next three are much more useful. And that is wastage that comes from something that is unreasonable, unreasonable expectations, unreasonable situations. What is reasonable and what is not? So things such as the need for overtime, the need for people to work longer and harder, the need for people to cancel their holidays, the need for unsafe work practices, things which result in risk for injury, risk for stress, risk for unnecessary tiredness, people that are not performing at their best. Basically, when any situation or system or person is stressed, they're often at risk of not performing at their best. The second is the how of something. The method. How is something actually done? How do we put the doors on this car? And can we do it more efficiently? How do we code this database? And can we do that more efficiently? And the third is the variation. Wastage that comes from the variation. So we've got 3 people working on this database, and one person's doing it one way, and one person's doing it slightly different, and another person's doing it another way again. Not necessarily completely different, but there's some variation in exactly how they go about writing their code. Now that might seem quite innocent on the surface, but then let's say sometime later, one person is given responsibility of maintaining this code. Not 3 that built it, but one person. And they then have to try and understand 3 different methods of crafting the same kind of thing. Inefficient? Definitely. So the reason these 3 different catch-alls exist is because this is where we go looking for these inefficiencies. This is where we go looking for the problem. So what I mean by that is that it's usually pretty easy to understand and look for categories of things where things have become unreasonable and wastage that can come out of that. It's a separate discussion from saying to someone, okay, well, tell me what's unfair about what's going on here, and that might help us find some wastage, as opposed to, well, tell me how you go about doing this, and let's see if we can talk about ways in which it might be improved. Which is a separate investigation from saying, well, hang on, A is different from B. Can we look at why that's the case, and can we improve that? So these are guides as to how we go about finding all these different forms of waste that exist in all this process. Now, before we kick on and talk about timing, I just want to check and see if anyone's got any curious question about wastage. I've got a question here from Alpha saying, defect is a part of creation, why it is a waste. So I'm going to interpret what the question is saying here. Defect is a part of creation, why is it a waste? The waste comes from the consequences of a defect. If something is created with the defect, then there are cost-related consequences for that. At the very worst case, the cost might be 100% wastage. It might be something that simply fails to work, can't be reclaimed, can't be repurposed, and has to be done again. In the case of intellectual property, you can often repurpose code or something that might be created, but often you can't. Creative ideas, for example, someone creates a logo for something, and that logo was from the wrong idea, was wrong colors, or actually colors pretty easy, but from the wrong perspective, and it gets junked, it gets cancelled. Well, that's 100% wastage, and it's a result of a defect. So the wastage comes from, and in many of these things, it's not a waste to do something, it's a waste to do it unnecessarily because it's an opportunity cost of everything. Everything has an opportunity cost, which is the thing that we could have done if we hadn't have done that thing that was a waste. So if that defective item hadn't been created, that same amount of time, effort, and energy could have potentially gone into creating something that was of value and could have had a return. And that's the principle behind not only the defect wastage, but everything. It's all about the opportunity cost. I've got another question that I'll take from William saying, I'm wondering if Lean specifies a role that is responsible for identifying and reducing waste, or is it all principle that all project participants are required to act on? Generally, Lean doesn't try and prescribe particular roles. So if you're thinking in terms of other methodologies of saying, well, we've got a title for this, and it's the the waste hunter. Not that that's a particularly good or bad title, but no, it doesn't really try and say, okay, well, this person's going to do this and this person's going to do that. It's a paradigm that's saying, well, there are inclusive processes. There are people are going to be in the right place at the right time to look at these sorts of things. And they're going to have different roles in different organizations. They're going to have different titles in different organizations. But they are going to be the people with the visibility to the information necessary to answer these questions. What Lean is saying, here's the question. You all think about it in this team and figure out who's the best person to get the answer. Who's responsible for the answer and who can contribute to the answer. Those are up to the organization to decide in most cases. Let's look at timing. Just in time, or what doesn't really mean not too late to do it properly. Just in time doesn't mean so close to being late that we're stressed and we're rushed. No, just in time means within reasonable time. You know, it doesn't mean that let's hold this off and play brinkmanship with timing. Let's make a comparison. Probably the best way to describe just-in-time, and just-in-time is one of the really key elements that Toyota brought to the party with what they were talking about in the 1980s. And just-in-time is something that feeds into flow. We talked about flow. Understanding just-in-time principles will help explain the nature of flow. And to do that, let's compare it to a just-in-case method. Just-in-case method, let's go back to our automobile construction process. Just-in-case method says, let's put a stockpile of 20 doors next to the door installers, just in case. Just in case what? Well, just in case the factory line speeds up, you know, just in case everyone is having a really buzzy day and we're producing more cars this week, and or just in case the door makers, decide to have a holiday. And we've got this stockpile of doors that we can use, so we'll be okay, just in case. In that mindset, we're saying that we are going to invest in a perceived risk. Now, when that risk is valid and real, such as the fact that, well, we know the entire team that creates doors are all going on their yearly sabbatical and they won't be available for 2 weeks, yeah, okay, a 2-week stockpile is probably a good idea. Well, similarly, having someone else create doors could also be a viable solution. But what I'm saying is that just in case is based on perceived risk. Just in time is a totally different approach to risk. It's saying, well, no, we're not going to invest in perceived and potential risk. We're going to invest on the basis that there's no risk, but we're going to invest on systems and processes that minimize the risks that we're now exposing ourselves to. Because obviously, if it's just in time, the risk that we're exposing ourselves to is, well, what if it's not in time? What if the doors don't arrive and the car's sitting there waiting for the doors to be put on? Well, in that situation, the investment, theoretically an equivalent investment, goes into making sure that the flow of the door makers knowing how many doors they've created, how many doors are expected, how many doors are expected next week, therefore how many staff do they need to have on making doors this week, because that's how many doors they're going to need by the end of the week, and how many doors need to be shipped on a daily basis to the section of the plant that installs the doors. All that investment in knowing exactly what's going on and making sure that everyone is delivering to that plan, that is a far more efficient investment, because that investment is directly contributing to profitability. The investment of saying, look, let's just make extra doors and have them there just in case, that investment is not an investment that directly translates into profitability. That investment can't be leveraged until there's a problem. That's the opposite of what Lean is saying. Lean is saying, let's not invest in things that don't leverage for us until something goes bad. Let's invest everything we can in making sure things don't go bad. And, you know, we'll just have to cope a little bit when they don't go so well. So, yeah, it means that when something goes wrong with the planning and the doors aren't ready and the car's waiting, yeah, that's the risk that you've exposed yourself to. And the idea is that that's less likely, that's easier to fix, easier to solve than the problem of having far too many doors that you don't know what to do with. This has the side effect of creating some potential urgency around the decision-making process. So I mentioned before in the example of the door-making team having to make planning decisions about exactly what they're doing. You think about the same thing in a software production. You've got certain people that are working on certain elements of the software that other people are going to be making use of in the near future. Well, they're going to be making decisions about planning their work and their time and their effort, their activities, so that at the end of the cycle that they're dealing with, they have got those things done by those certain timeframes, because that's what the flow demands of them. They're going to be making decisions on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a regular basis to make sure that they are in line with that delivery plan and that flow. They need to be empowered adequately to make their decisions. Now, this is the reverse of the plan-based, process-based empowerment. Where the plan is empowered, where the process is empowered, the people are not making these decisions. They're looking up the book and saying, well, according to the manual, we need to do it this way and we need to produce X number. And these processes aren't as dynamic as people are. And the reality is that in a tight flow situation, you do have dynamic consequences. You have things that will impact the current state of flow at any point in time. And so empowered people can make urgent decisions and keep the flow tight. So it's a necessary side effect of all of this. And of course, the way in which the flow and the decisions are made is with communication. So the communication flow of information necessary, people need to have visibility to the right information. And of course, this is different from the old-fashioned paradigm where the managers got the reports and everyone else was kept in the dark. This is all you need to know. Let's not confuse everybody with other information. Well, in the lean, in the flow principle, they need to know a lot more than they used to. They need to know the full details about what's going on and what are the impacts or what are the consequences of any decision that they make or are empowered to make. And it needs to be aligned with the overall purpose. So the processes by which the decisions are made are somewhat different. They have a different emphasis, they have a different focus, and they have a different idea. Plato once said, a good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. We have come from recently, and many of us still live in a place or in an organization where decisions are made by numbers or from numbers on a spreadsheet, by people whose job it is to interpret those numbers. Thousands of years ago, somebody by the name of Plato thought that that wasn't the best idea, and that a more broad, comprehensive understanding of the context of the situation was going to give a more effective solution or effective decision. And that's what lean is embracing. So let's discuss flow in a little more detail. How do you get flow? What are the factors that contribute to the creation of flow? Here's a quick graph or chart that we whipped up earlier. I want to talk about what some of these things do and what role they play in the creation of flow. So we've already talked about the fact that flow is a tight sequencing of events based on the flow of capacity. So the idea of vacuum capacity, this point at the top here, vacuum capacity is the idea of saying that when there is capacity, it creates a vacuum which sucks the next thing in. Now, obviously not literally. I'm not talking about this in physical terms, but I'm talking about the opportunity for a piece of capacity to be utilized will create pressure to pull forward whatever it needs to be working on. It's very similar to the law of vacancy. I don't know if any of you have talked about the law of vacancy as it applies to our lives. The law of vacancy, as it was described to me once, it says that if perhaps, example, imagine that you and your partner have decided that you're going to replace the curtains. Now, if that's anything like my household, that might happen in the next year or two, or it might not. But the law of vacancy says that, well, the first thing you do is you tear down your old curtains. And when you grow tired of the neighbours staring at you all the time through the open windows, you will find the energy and motivation to go and get new curtains. So, similar, you can extrapolate that example to many different things. So what this means is that it's in human nature to fill the void, fill the demand, fill the requirement. It is quite the opposite when it comes to saying, well, okay, they've got enough doors, I can slacken off now, I can take it easy. They've got enough of what they need from me, I can take my time. What happens intellectually in the human mind is it's a lot harder to ramp that person or that activity or that energy back up to a higher level once it's wound down. It is a lot easier to have a flow that says, oh, hang on, they've been able to use more of what we've been creating, so we're going to have to do a little bit extra and keep them busy. It's a lot easier to do both in a process, operationally, and intellectually, philosophically, and emotionally for human beings. So we're talking about gaps over crunch. This is an analogy of saying it's preferred in the lean methodology, and because it's a lot easier to fix. If you have gaps in the line, gaps in the flow, they are usually quicker and easier to solve on the basis of what we just discussed than it is to solve having a crunch where you have too much of something or something butting up against something because it's been stalled or slowed down. So the push idea where, the pressure of something getting pushed down the line, the fact that someone has got 25 doors waiting to be installed, is that really going to pressure them to put the doors on faster? Well, maybe for the first few doors, but then you know what happens? We get used to the fact that there's 25 doors sitting there waiting for us to put in, and we tune it out, and it ceases to be a motivational factor for us. It becomes the status quo, the new normal. So crunch, compression of the flow, is harder to fix, persistent for a lot longer. Better to have a tight flow which can occasionally have gaps. Excess is waste is a way of saying that anything that we don't need is considered potential wastage. So flow means that, for example, it's another way of saying you don't want to have 25 doors waiting to be installed. You don't need excess of anything. You don't produce something just in case. It's considered a waste. The same thing happens with software development. You don't create more than you know you're going to be able to need at any point in time. You don't do extra work that you're not going to be sure you're going to be able to leverage. What this leads to is an intense scrutiny of what the obstacles and challenges are moment by moment. So again, led by the fact that gaps over crunch says that a gap in a tight process will much more readily become apparent because there will be a capacity vacuum. There'll be somebody idle, something not getting done. That alarm bell will be far more easily detected and acted upon. The obstacles and challenges in a flow system are going to be far more obvious and more quickly realized. And the point here about value streams is that this whole idea of flow needs to be kept in mind as to exactly what the value is we're trying to create. What's this thing that comes out at the other end? How does this flow contribute to the ultimate vision? It's just a warning. It's an inseparable component to say that it's not about just having a flow that creates something that might or might not be useful. We've always got to make sure that what we're creating is an inherent part of the value that we're trying to build at the end of the day. This leads us to talk about pull. Now, the very end of the line when it comes to the pull philosophy is the client. The client is the one at the very end who is saying, well, we want this. We need that. And whether it's internal or external customer doesn't really matter. That's the beginning of the pull philosophy. And that's where the vision is defined about what needs to happen. Within the value stream, the creation cycle, pull is another way of talking about the vacuum capacity. Now, again, let's describe this by looking at its opposite. Let's look at the forecast model as an opposing view to help explain what we mean by the pull model. So the forecast model is a way of looking at the push mentality. This is where we say, well, we think we're going to need this many, we think we're going to need this, and we're planning to have this, this, and this. So we will forecast a investment of energy and resources and effort in order to accomplish certain outputs. So the decisions about how much is going to be made and how much effort is going to be invested are made before even the first bit of effort is actually done, before anything happens. So the opposite of that is to say, well, we're going to have the rate of production and the extent and the degree of production guided by the flow of capacity through the process, through the creation process. So as people complete something and have the capacity to do something more, then we will make sure, as best as we can in the moment, that they have what they need. So the pull concept applies at both the macro and the micro level. It's not only at the macro level, at the customer level, saying that we're only going to create the features, we're only going to do the user stories that the customer has asked of us. And at the micro level, in the creation of the work to fulfill even just one particular user story, we're going to make sure that each step along the way only happens when it's ready for it, when the next step is ready. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule. I'm not saying that it should be punishable by death to say, well, you know, we're going to make sure that no one's ever going to do more than they need to do. There is a give and take. It is a flow. And like water flowing downstream, there's an enormous amount of micro variation that takes place. So whilst it's driven by pull, whilst it's driven by what's meant to happen next, there's always that certain amount of variation that occurs, and it's in that variation that we need to monitor for tolerances. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean there by that. Let's go back to the example we've been using all along, the installation of doors on the side of a vehicle during its construction process. Okay, we know that 2 doors need to arrive before or when the vehicle arrives on the assembly line. But do they arrive 2 minutes before they're needed? Do they arrive 10 minutes before they're needed? Do they arrive 10 seconds before? Or do they arrive the day before? Those are decisions that we work with and that we monitor and that we look at. Lean doesn't specifically answer that question. Lean asks the question. Make sure you've got an answer. So pull lives in the timing of everything, including decisions, because everything only happens when it's aligned with the decision that it's part of. So pull is also about information. Information is pulled. Now, again, this is in opposition to the paradigm that exists in a lot of organizations today. We're going to send out information. We're going to just broadcast an email. Hey, by the way, everyone, for your information, here's some info. And maybe you'll need it, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll need it in 6 months, maybe you won't. The information flow in a pull paradigm is saying, well, we're going to empower people to know what kind of information they're going to need and where they can get it, how they can get it, and they will pull that information to them as and when they need it. A couple of things come out of that. Obviously, making sure that the opportunity and investing in the opportunity to make sure that people can get access to the right information as and when they need it means that they're far more likely to actually get the right information in a timely manner, as opposed to, well, we sent you that 6 months ago, I hope you can find it. There's obviously a greater wastage of time and effort to find the right information, as opposed to a system that is meant to give it when it's needed. The other part is, of course, the intellectual cost and burden of remembering that, hang on, didn't I get that information some time ago? Maybe I should look for it. How many times have someone asked you to resend an email simply because they couldn't find it, or perhaps didn't look? So the pull methodology, the pull idea, it relies on everything being just in time, and everything being just in time relies on people being empowered to make the decisions, to have the review, to look at all these variables that take place in the just-in-time paradigm and make sure that they're constantly working towards the final result. We haven't really talked about it much here, although we did go into a bit of detail on it in the pre-recorded audio. But there is an undercurrent of the concept that it's empowered people that make this successful. And this is usually the trap. This is where organizations that try to go lean often get caught up, because they don't sufficiently empower the people to be part of the lean paradigm. Lean, from a top-down management point of view, is going to be extremely difficult, if not unworkable, for most organizations, because the whole point of introspection needs to happen at every layer and at every level of the organization and at every moment of the day that it needs to. And it needs to be unfettered. And for that to happen, people need to be empowered to engage with that thinking and that methodology and that process, however the methodology is defined. They need the freedom to do it, which means they need to be capable. And as Confucius once said, ability will never catch up with the demand for it. We always need our people to be better. Now, we've got one more slide to talk about that I promised, and then we will have time for any last-minute questions that we've got before we wrap up tonight. But the last thing in that list of principles that we talked about was value streams. Now, here is a perhaps slightly messy and generic diagram to have a look at and have a talk about. The point here is not to understand what each of these symbols mean. What we're saying is, when you have a value stream, this can be as simple as the high-level value stream of creation might be. This is the starting point. And when you're talking about a project that's saying, well, we're going to create something, okay, so at the highest level, we're going to do this step, this step, this step, and this step, and this is going to be part of it. We're going to create this component. We're going to create this element. Now, each of these might then break down into smaller and more detailed value streams in smaller and smaller teams. But, for example, if you look at the first box on the bottom left, which is an activity that needs to take place, then the team responsible for that might then create their own more detailed value stream. But the important point is that that team will create it. And that team will be responsible for making sure that it is sufficiently lean and that to hunt down the things that don't need to happen, that shouldn't happen. So value streams is literally the process of achieving the outcome. This is just when the work happens. This is the steps, the process, the activities that need to take place. And it'll obviously be unique to the project involved or to the activity involved, whether it be a standalone project or whether it be an ongoing line of business activity. But as you can see, it's very high level. And the details get separated and broken down. But then you still need this high level awareness of what's going on to see the interconnectedness and the interdependencies that take place between the high level elements in the value stream. So it's a diagrammatic method for trying to capture how these processes should look in order to achieve the vision that was identified in the beginning by the customer. So let's see if in the last few minutes we've got any extra questions that we can tackle and have a chat about before we wrap it up for everybody. I'm just having a look here to see a couple of. We've got a question from Joy. How does Six Sigma and Lean compare? There's a lot of overlap in the modern application of Six Sigma. This was something that hopefully we were able to shed a little bit of light on when we were looking at good quality. Six Sigma is kind of a modern expression of the evolving and growing concepts of how to maximize quality. I mean, Six Sigma is about making sure that your error count is as small as possible. That's the whole principle of the matter. So it's about repeatability, predictability, certainty and assurance. Now, these are things that people will find very familiar in plan-based project management. Plan-based project management is all about certainty, assurance, guarantees, making sure. And in terms of outputs, Six Sigma has a similar philosophy, a similar approach. It's about making sure and finding out all the reasons why and dealing with them. So Lean is saying, well, yes, variation is a waste, and let's try and deal with that. But Lean is very happy to say, well, look, okay, if you want to use some of the methodologies of Six Sigma in order to minimize your variation in a production line, we'll go for it. They dovetail in nicely. Similarly, Lean will say, well, you know, if you're doing a standalone project of something and you don't want to use elements of the Scrum methodology to do that, we'll go for it. That's okay too. A question from Colin saying, is benchmarking a pointless exercise in the Agile organization? Benchmarking, no, I don't think it is a pointless exercise, but it depends on exactly what you mean and how you apply benchmarking. If you're talking about the art of comparison, the art of saying, well, look, if we have this benchmark, this baseline, this idea, let's talk about it from a production point of view and from a creation point of view. We know that you know, these three people, if they work together, they can produce kind of this amount of material, or you know, they can work on this amount of code per week. If you don't know that, or if you don't know what something can create out of something, well, then some kind of benchmarking process might be appropriate. But if you're creating something from scratch, from the beginning, and you have a large amount of capacity questions, then yeah, some of the things that benchmarking do might answer some of those questions. But it's not a case of saying it's either in or out. It's not an absolute. It's not about saying, well, it's not part of the methodology. Agile doesn't say thou shalt, should or should not benchmark. Agile says that, well, you need to have enough knowledge about capacity, potential, and output in order to make decisions. And when you don't know enough about it, maybe what you do in a step one or a first iteration is you might view that as being similarly information gathering to kind of feel a little bit like a benchmarking process. You don't have to call it that. You can just call it iteration one. And out of that iteration, you'll learn a lot about how things are done and what kind of outputs you get, and you'll then be able to make new decisions next time. So the constant do and review idea means that in some ways the whole point of benchmarking gets wrapped into what you do on a daily basis. You could argue potentially that you're always doing some kind of benchmarking because you're always able to make use of the new information about what actually happens and how it works. Simon's got a question. How does value streams apply to software development? So typically once a component is signed off, that value stream stops. It seems lean implies to repeatable delivery. Lean was created in the environment of repeatable delivery. So its origins live there. How would it apply to software development? It doesn't need to be repeatable in nature because it's not the specific user story that is repeated, but the whole process of creating code is going to have repeatable elements within it. Sure, the lines of code are different, but exactly how it gets done and how it's tested, how it's reviewed, how it's conceptualized, and those steps and activities, they're going to be somewhat similar regardless of exactly which user story is being worked on. So from that point of view, lean can apply very effectively to software development. When you look at how do you develop and deliver any user story, what's your process? What's your method? How do you want, what questions are you going to ask? And how are you going to make sure that you're not wasting your time? How are you going to make sure that, you know, to do this user story with 3 or 4 people in the team that are working on it, how do you make sure that one person isn't spending their time doing the wrong thing, working on the wrong thing, etc.? You need to answer those questions in that process. Again, this is where lean is telling you what to think about, but the specifics of the situation are what answers them. So yes, you still have aspects of that that are considered repeatable even in software development, unless you have this situation where everyone in the team only is going to create one thing and that's it, which is not what I've tended to come across. So yeah, that situation could be a little bit different. Question from Elizabeth: has lean been applied in a not-for-profit organisation? Seems very commercially focused to me. Well, there's an answer to that in some of what lean talks about. Lean is saying that every organisation operates on commercial principles of value. Not money, but value. So every organisation, even a not-for-profit organisation, is looking for value in the sense that they exist to create certain things to have certain outcomes, and those certain outcomes have value to somebody, and that's why they exist. Now, they might be in a situation where they have to operate on a neutral profit basis. All that means is that whatever profit they would have made gets reinvested. So lean is certainly applicable in a not-for-profit organisation, because if you would have had more profit, then you would reinvest that in producing more output. Therefore, you create more value, and you're a more valuable organisation as a result. So absolutely, I would say that it is every bit as relevant and appropriate in organisations that are meant for profit as those that aren't. I would draw no distinction whatsoever, because there's nothing about being not for profit that says that it's okay to be, you know, kind of fat and lazy and inefficient. Lorraine is saying, can we use the push model in any other Agile methodologies? Generally, push and Agile are not going to line up in most cases. If you're talking about other methodologies, let's say, for example, Scrum, are you going to use is push in any way going to feature in how Scrum works? Well, not really, because in Scrum, each iteration, each sprint is going to be filled based on the available capacity. You're not going to turn around and say, well, look, you know, we think we can probably get about 15 user stories done in this sprint, so let's try and get 20 done. Let's put them on the list and just hope that, you know, maybe people work a bit harder. No, that is going to be a contradiction to the principle, because the whole important point about in that methodology is you want to make sure that what gets done at the end of the sprint is complete. And if you put too much on the sprint backlog, then you've got too much of a risk that you'll get things half done, too many things half done, and therefore they won't be evaluated. So generally, no, I would say that it's unlikely that you'll find any kind of push thinking to be aligned with and successful in Agile thinking in general, because Agile thinking is all about reacting and adapting to the situation as and when it develops. And if, as and when it develops, you find that you've already over-invested in the wrong thing due to a push, well, then you've already made your mistake, and it's a lot harder to reverse it. Harley is saying timing of information flow seems contradictory to the concept of empowered individuals discussed previously. So difficult to know how to disseminate info based on just-in-time. Perhaps if we ask the question of the role of dissemination. The idea of empowered individuals is that if they are clear and they know the questions they need to be asking of themselves, the questions they need to be asking of the system, the questions they need to be asking of their colleagues, then what remains to be empowered is their ability to go and get that information. This is, in fact, the opposite of the dissemination idea. Dissemination of information says that information must be transmitted from source to destination. What we're saying here is the reverse. The information doesn't need to be transmitted. No one needs to make any decisions about how information gets sent out. What needs to be sent out is the education of how to find the information when you need it. So yeah, okay, that needs to be disseminated, but that's more of a process. This is where you go to find this kind of information, and this is the skills you need and how to search for it, and this is who you ask for, or this is how you get it. And you, as an empowered individual, decide what you need to know and when you need to know it, and you get it yourself by somehow of means. So that's the paradigm and idea, and I don't see that there's really a clash between that, as long as we keep in mind that the traditional idea of informing people can almost completely go away. What you need to inform them of is the obligations, and they need to have enough empowerment and capability to then know that if they're going to fulfill those obligations, they need to pull to themselves the kind of information they need to act upon. Question from Roll is saying, what methodology is being used in open source projects? Is Scrum and Lean applicable? I don't see a conflict with anything the way in which open source projects are created. I mean, if you're talking about open source projects, if you're talking, for example, about community-based projects, collaborative projects, where crowdsourced perhaps might be an area where you're going to say, okay, we've got a crowdsourced open source project where the public are potentially contributing to something. How are you going to model that in an Agile phenomenon? I would actually suggest that probably Agile is the only way that you can manage that sort of thing, because in a crowdsourced open source scenario, you've got no way of predicting what the contributions are going to be from the people that you don't actually have directly working with you. So you don't necessarily know that somebody who you never heard of, never met, isn't going to send you something really great that should be involved or added or is a great little thing to add to the open source project. So yeah, I would think that it could even be the best, and for some people it might even be the only. I don't know if anyone's actually got experience of that. That would be an interesting question, I think, for the forum. If anyone listening does have some experience with that particular situation, I'd be keen to hear about what your experiences are and how they relate to the ability to use Agile methods or not with any of that. Let's see if we've got maybe one more question, it seems, unless there's any last-minute questions you want to jump in at the end. Giovanna is saying, just to clarify, flow is used to identify dependencies and value streams is used to determine implementation. Yes, pretty good way of describing it, actually. Flow is about the interconnectedness of the individual steps in the value stream. So flow is how things connect to each other inside a value stream, which is the big picture of activity, the summary of activity. And the flow is the connection points within that activity. Hopefully that, I think that's sort of just saying what you're saying in a slightly different way, but hopefully it's adding to the clarity of what you're saying. But I think that's not a bad way to express it. All right, just before we wrap up tonight, I just want to remind you, everyone, of the summary. If you haven't already, please check out the online portal. Great place to find things that all you need to do. Tune into the forums. Hopefully people might have some other interesting things to say after the discussion tonight. Do listen to the recordings. I know I've stressed this. There is even more good stuff in the recordings than we cover in this webinar, more than half, so please get into that and have a look at it. And one more week to go. Next week is week 4. Please do drop in for the Scrum versus Lean Showdown. Well, no, not really. We are going to try and do our best to give opinions and perspectives on how these things can work separately, together, where they're good, where they're bad, etc. And hopefully that will answer a lot of your remaining lingering questions. So thanks everyone for tuning in for now. It's been great to see everyone online. We've had a great number of great turnout again tonight. Thanks for all of that. I look forward to chatting to you all next week. Until then, thank you very much and good night.